Xuan Yuan Sword 7 is unlike any game I've ever played. At various points in my playthrough, I was reminded of the likes of Uncharted, Metal Gear Solid, and Final Fantasy, but the end result is something that feels truly unique, while also feeling familiar. Xuan Yuan Sword 7 is most easily classified as an action RPG, but I think it's more accurate to call it a narrative action game with light RPG elements. Roughly half of my entire playthrough was spent watching cutscenes, while the other half was a mix of combat, puzzles, and light exploration. The first thing you should know about Xuan Yuan Sword 7 is that it is an incredibly linear game. I found that surprising, since all the screenshots and marketing made it seem more in line with The Witcher, while in actuality, Xuan Yuan's level design has more in common with Crash Bandicoot. The entire game is basically one continual hallway, with some nooks and crannies hiding a chest here or a breakable vase there, and some dungeons have a few outcrops or alternate routes to discover, but the vast majority of this game is spent traveling in one direction along a perfectly linear hallway. Even when you come upon a branching path, much like in Crash, you'll always end up back on the one true path. There are fast travel points for backtracking in order to complete side quests or to visit specific shops, but otherwise it's a straight shot from beginning to end. I can imagine this linearity alone might really turn some players off. There is very little freedom in Xuan Yuan Sword 7, and at first I was really surprised and a bit disappointed by how on rails the whole experience was. But over time, I got used to it and came to appreciate it for what it is. Xuan Yuan Sword 7's main focus is telling its story, and the story is omnipresent. Cutscenes pop up roughly every 5 to 10 minutes and on average last around 5 minutes apiece. There is a red location marker on your screen at all times showing you where the next story objective is located, and it's hardly ever more than 200 meters away. Once you arrive, a cutscene will trigger. There's also constant chatter between your companions as you move from objective to objective, so you'll be reading a lot of text as you move between story beats and combat encounters. There are also bonfires which allow you to save, but also carry their own little character-centric story beats, much like Xenoblade's Heart to Hearts. Here's where the comparison to Metal Gear Solid comes in. The gameplay is constantly being interrupted by cutscenes. On the whole, the story is very good, so once I was deep enough along to become invested in the characters, the cutscenes didn't necessarily bother me, but I often felt like I was watching a season of a TV show with some light gameplay interspersed. If you don't click with the narrative, you won't click with this game. So how is the story? It's good. Not incredible, not mind-blowing, but good enough. I haven't had much exposure to Chinese mythological or historical narratives, so to be honest, it took a couple of hours to get a grasp on the various names, tribes, histories, and locations, but the game generously provides an encyclopedia with all the information you might need. The encyclopedia is also written in first person, as if each page is a journal entry from one of the characters, and I really appreciated its inclusion. Also, going forward, I'm going to butcher pronunciations for the rest of this review, so please forgive me. The crux of the story is this. You play as Taishi Zhao, beginning as a boy, fleeing the destruction of your home and the murder of your parents with only your baby sister Zhang and a magical scroll. Years later, while living a peaceful existence in the forest, the past catches up to our heroes and Zhang is killed. Unwilling to accept the death of his sister, Zhao engages the help of an imprisoned mythical being named the King, who promises to rebuild Zhang's body if Zhao releases him. Meanwhile, Zhang's soul is placed in an automaton, and the two siblings set off on a quest to release the king, get revenge, and resurrect Zhang's body. What follows is a pretty meandering plot, mostly consisting of arriving at a new location where an object or person has been spotted, helping the locals with a problem, whether it's a war with a neighboring tribe, or wolves blocking a path, gaining new information upon aiding the locals, and moving on to the next objective. This is very much a quest narrative, with many smaller scale conflicts, stories, and characters dotting the path between you and your larger goal of saving your sister. Once you have your party of 4 traveling companions, much of the story time is spent developing the relationships between the characters. It's a good thing I really liked all of them, since you'll be spending a lot of time with them. Some of the plot threads and reasons for following certain leads were lost on me, but the ultimate goal is easy enough to keep track of even if you lose some details along the way. One major issue here is that the cutscenes aren't pausable, nor are they repeatable, nor is there a log of the dialogue. So if you miss something, you really missed it, and sometimes revelations are thrown at you so quickly it can be a bit challenging to keep up, especially if you are unfamiliar with Chinese nomenclature. The one major issue with the story is the translation. Now, it's not terrible, and you can make perfect sense of what's going on, but there are enough grammatical errors and linguistic mistakes that it stood out to me as feeling unfinished. I'm not one to usually notice or care about translation issues, but the dialogue here often felt stilted, emotionless, and otherwise just a little off. Again, it's not a huge deal, and it's not the worst that I've seen, but it's still something to be aware of. The voice acting, while exclusively in Chinese, sounded really good to me. I came to rely on the emotions of the voice actors to deduce the intended effect of the dialogue, since the English translation didn't always make the intonations obvious. And while the Chinese voice acting sounded great, I do think this game could have benefited from having an English dub. Hearing the names, locations, and other Chinese words pronounced properly and in context may have helped, simply because so much of my time was spent trying to remember who the Lu Jing were or what village the Moists were from. Again, this could easily come down to my lack of proper education and experience with the Chinese language, but for Westerners like myself, I imagine an English dub could have made this barrier to entry a bit more permeable. That barrier is also one of Xuan Yuan Sword 7's greatest strengths, though, too. I have played a ton of Japanese games. I'm used to the Japanese language, but since most Chinese games I've heard of are relegated to the strategy genre, like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, I've skipped most of them, as that's not really my preferred genre. The mythology here feels new, the culture interesting, and the Chinese language voiceover made for a really unique experience. I'm glad to have experienced a culture, history, and mythology I knew very little about, and I hope more experiences like Xuan Yuan Sword 7 from around the world are brought to the West. The barrier to entry for the uninitiated is absolutely worth it, and it's a fascinating glimpse into a culture rarely explored in video games. The music is also spectacular. The score has some serious highs, like a sequence in a cave that features throat singing. It's dark and moody when necessary, but can be majestic and sweeping too. The music here hits the same highs as a summer blockbuster movie score, and it really elevates the entire experience. If you haven't noticed, I'm front-loading this review with all of the narrative elements because I want to make sure that you know going in that the story is the primary focus in this game. If I started talking about combat, you might think that most of the game is action-focused, but the action really only takes up like 25% of the package. 50% story, 25% action, and 25% exploration and puzzles. So let's finally talk about the combat. It's fast-paced and fun, if nothing spectacular. There's a lock-on, but switching between targets isn't as fluid as it should be, as you can't jump to targets outside of your range of vision, so if an opponent is behind you, you can't snap around to face them like you can in other similar combat-focused games. There are two main attacks, performed with R and ZR. The standard R combo doesn't change throughout the game, and you'll be mashing it a lot. ZR is reserved for various stances, two of which you can hot swap between during any given fight using ZL. Each stance levels up on its own over time the more you use it, which amounts to using the ZR attack as much as possible during a fight in order to fully upgrade the stance. You'll first unlock additional combo animations for each, then a dodge attack, and finally an ultimate attack that runs on a cooldown by pressing Y. There are 7 stances in total, 2 of which are unlocked through optional boss fights. 3 of the 7 stances also feature Final Fantasy-style summons, where a giant monster will teleport down and rain terror all over your foes. That seems like a good amount of variety, but ultimately they play pretty much the same. I was never changing up my tactics based on my stance. I was changing stances based on which ultimate cooldown had charged back up already. You'll partner up with 2 companions throughout the game too, although neither are playable. They act as additional attackers, and they have specials which you can trigger at will, which are also on a cooldown. I didn't feel like they added much to the combat besides some visual flair on the battlefield, but they do make the whole affair look flashier and feel grander than it really is. The most interesting element of combat are the scroll abilities. There are 2 abilities tied to the magic scroll MacGuffin that you have with you at all times. First, you can slow down time, allowing you to dodge around shielded enemies and get off some extra bullet time combos. More interestingly though, there's a portal attack that locks enemies into a confined circle that slowly shrinks in size. If you defeat the enemy while they're in the circle, you'll collect their souls. Early on, I was hooked on this mechanic, even waiting to kill enemies until the portal cooldown reset so I could make sure to collect their souls upon dispatching them. But unfortunately, this mechanic is deeply underutilized. It could have been an awesome Pokemon-like catch mechanic, but ultimately the souls are just an expendable resource, even though each enemy provides a unique soul. It would have been cool to have a Xenoblade-style Collectopedia, where collecting souls unlocks special costumes or resources or something, but unfortunately that's not the case. Halfway through the game, I had more souls than I ever needed to fully upgrade anything I wanted to upgrade. Which is a shame because this mechanic had the potential to set the combat apart from other similar games in the genre, but it never really delivers on that promise. You can also parry using L, which I hardly ever use since it was always easier to dodge roll. Maybe the parry is useful on harder difficulties, but that's not really my jam. There's also an execution mechanic if you deplete an enemy's stance meter, which, while cool to watch, didn't necessarily add much to the overall combat experience outside of a few boss fights. There are also healing items and buff items that are mapped to the D-pad. And that's basically it. There is a good variety of enemy types, and the later parts of the game can get really challenging with the swarms of enemies that are thrown at you, but ultimately my tactics never changed. Dodge roll around an incoming attack, set up a portal, wail on R and ZR until they're dead, use a finisher before the circle depletes, repeat. Maybe on the harder difficulties, the nuances between the different stances demand more strategy, but I didn't find the combat satisfying enough to test that out. It's fun in a mindless sort of way, much more Zelda than Dark Souls, but there's enough variety to keep things interesting, and there's enough story time between fights that I was always looking forward to the combat. The puzzles are ripped right out of Tomb Raider or Uncharted. They are all of the environmental variety, where something in the environment gives you a clue as to how to move a block or turn a lever or raise or lower a bridge. They're pretty clever and infrequent enough that they broke up the pace of the adventure in a nice way. When you reach the first puzzle, you're even given the option to skip them entirely if you'd rather just focus on the story and combat. I think that's a great inclusion for those people who might just not want to do puzzles. For me, they felt like the right level of difficulty without being too vexing or feeling like brain-dead wastes of time either. My only gripe is that pushing or pulling blocks or turning wheels or levers locks you into the movement animation, and those take forever. If you accidentally push a block in the wrong direction, you'll have to wait until Zhao pushes the block all the way over to the next spot, then wait as he pushes it all the way back again. This locked-in animation style actually carries over to the exploration too. When you come across a wall to climb or a narrow passageway to crawl through, you'll hit a contextual button and Zhao basically does it on his own. There are some Uncharted-style ledges to jump from one to another, but they amount to pushing the analog stick in the direction you want to go, and that's it. It makes the movement feel very gamey and restricted. These physical animation restrictions made the already limited exploration just feel even more limited. It would have been nice to see these light environmental sections fleshed out a bit more like their obvious inspirations. While this is technically an RPG, I found its RPG systems to be lackluster. You'll level up, but are unable to allocate any stat points, so there's no customization to speak of. All of the upgrades are buried in a menu called Elysium, the parallel world that exists within your magic scroll. Within this menu are 5 other menus, one for weapon upgrades, one for armor crafting, one for accessory crafting, one for soul fusing, and one for soul upgrading. All of these upgrades are based around an item economy, most of which you'll find out in the wild by defeating enemies, collecting souls, and finding chests. Each of these menus are also upgradable, which in turn unlocks more upgrades in each. Honestly, the only 2 I found terribly helpful were the weapon upgrades and the soul upgrades, but upgrading your weapon is locked behind finding certain items, some of which don't appear until later in the game. This means that once the game is ready for you to upgrade your kit, it'll start dishing out the needed materials for those upgrades. So the upgrades scale with the enemy difficulty as you progress, but the ultimate feel of this way of handling upgrades means the early combat largely plays the same as the late stage combat. You'll be growing stronger when the game tells you to grow stronger. There's no real thought or decision you'll need to make. Just keep an eye on Elysium and upgrade your kit when upgrades become available. Soul crafting is mildly interesting in that you first have to find recipes to craft souls, which provide buffs or valuable enhancements like extra coins dropped from enemies or a percentage increase to attack or defense. Then you can upgrade these souls, turning a 5% attack increase into a 15% attack increase by using the souls that you've collected from trapping enemies in portals. But any old soul works to upgrade any other. The difficulty of the enemy soul which you've collected simply equates to how much of the upgrade bar that soul will increase. So for example, you may need 10 wolf souls to upgrade your attack soul, but only 2 ogre souls to upgrade at the same amount. Remember the whole soul collecting element from combat that I talked about earlier, where you trap enemies in portals and collect their unique souls? Yeah, this is the only place that element is ever used. It feels like such a central mechanic in combat, but the rewards are measly and, well, unrewarding. I really wish there had been an extra layer of complexity here, whether in how upgrading works or in customizing and differentiating your character. You aren't really allowed to roleplay in this RPG unless you consider equipping a 10% less burning damage soul versus a 10% less bleeding damage one counts. It appears at first glance that this is a really complex, in-depth system, but in reality, it's just a simple way of keeping your character stats up as the game progresses. My Zhao and your Zhao will be functionally identical when we both reach the end of the game. Come to Xuan Yuan Sword 7 for the story, characters, and fun combat, not for the RPG systems. There are main story quests and side quests. Main story quests are always pushing you forward, with hardly any backtracking, while side quests make ample use of the fast travel points as you zip around the map killing wolves, finding missing family members, and fetching items. There aren't very many of them, but they all have some little story beat associated with them, so while they felt worthwhile, they never felt necessary. I think I probably would have given Xuan Yuan Sword 7 the same score, regardless of whether the side quests were part of the game or not. Except for one. One of the longest and most in-depth side quests in the game is a village-hopping journey to become the best Shaolu, the best Shaolu chess player in the region. I had never heard of Shaolu chess before, and normally I stay clear of any side quest, card, or board game in games like this, but I almost immediately became obsessed with Shaolu chess. Apparently it's a variation of another game called Nine Men's Morris, or Cowboy Checkers, which I also had never heard about until I saw it being played at a booth at a Renaissance fair last weekend, recognized it as Shaolu Chess from Xuan Yuan Sword 7, and got into an extended conversation with the elvish shopkeeper who ultimately sold me a board so I could play it with my daughter. That's how much I like Shaolu chess. Shaolu chess is like an advanced version of tic-tac-toe, played on a board with 3 concentric squares, where each player takes turns placing pieces, trying to make a line of 3. When you make 3 in a row, you can remove one of the other player's pieces. Upon removing an opponent's piece, that spot is now blocked and can't be used again. The rub of the game is that there are special pieces, such as one that can only be placed on a block spot, or one that blocks every spot around it, or another that lets you take an additional piece from an opponent. As you complete matches, you'll gain your opponent's best piece, so each subsequent match becomes more and more complicated as these special pieces increase the complexity of the game with each match, and demand that you adjust your strategy. The one issue here is that later in the game, since you are only able to bring 6 special pieces into any match, and you have no way of knowing what special pieces your opponent has, it becomes harder to plan strategically. But that is otherwise a very small blemish in one of my favorite parts of this game. I highly recommend you dive into this side activity if you pick this game up, and I'd absolutely purchase an entire game based around Shaolu chess. It was that fun and that addicting. Visually, this game is a little rough on Switch. I have a very high tolerance for jaggies, pop-ins, stuttering frame rates, and low-res textures, but if those are deal breakers for you, then maybe stay clear of Xuan Yuan until a patch. Most environmental edges have that typical Unreal Engine Switch port look to them, and the frame rate can get pretty stuttery. Personally, these visual downgrades never got in the way of my enjoyment of the combat or the story, but they are present, especially the jaggies in handheld mode. Docked looks significantly better. I want to give the developers credit for including 2 graphics options in the menu too, one to turn on or off anti-aliasing, and another to disable the depth of field effect, which I immediately turned off. Another incredibly minor but perpetual gripe I have is the way that fabric is handled in this port. The frame rates of the fabrics in this game have been dropped to lower than the rest of the game's frame rates, which sounds like nitpicking until you realize that you'll be watching Zhao's cape flutter around at 10 frames per second as he runs around for the entire game. Okay, it totally is nitpicking, but I never stopped noticing it throughout my playthrough, so I figured I'd mention it here. Some environmental backdrops look quite nice though, like clifftop views, vast meadows below, or a snowy mountain off in the distance. There are small details that really stood out too, like how as I explored, a layer of fog rolled in that obscured the whole area only to dissipate on its own after a while. I don't think anything specific triggered the fog coming or going, it just felt very natural, which was a cool little immersive detail. Xuan Yuan Sword 7 is a strange game. If its narrative hooks you, like it did for me, I think you'll enjoy the rest of it as well. If it doesn't, I imagine the perpetual cutscenes that break up the gameplay will seriously damper your enjoyment of this game. And unfortunately, I don't think there's really enough meat here without the story to justify the action on its own. Taken as a whole package though, I really enjoyed Xuan Yuan Sword 7. I appreciate how dedicated the developer was to its vision and the story it wanted to tell. This is a great entry point into this series, as I've never played any of the other games, and this story stands alone. I appreciated its linearity, with little time wasted on filler, which kept the story moving at a brisk pace. I even appreciated the lack of complexity in its RPG systems, letting me mostly ignore those features until I ran into a difficulty spike, at which time I'd upgrade everything and hop right back into the fight. Xuan Yuan Sword 7 is not what I was expecting, and it's certainly niche, but I'm really glad I gave it a chance. And if you're at all interested in a good Chinese mythological story, I recommend you check it out too. I'm going to give Xuan Yuan Sword 7 an 8.3 out of 10. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you liked this review, and if you did, it would mean a lot if you'd like and subscribe. Are there any other good games that focus on Chinese mythology that I should check out? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.